Hi friends, happy Friday. We just talked about chapters 31, 32, 33. Ruth and Isabel are safely for now, Isabel says, in a good position working for the Patriots because the reason we believe is because way back in Williamsburg, when Curzon first enlisted in the army, he also enlisted Ruth and Isabel, and the way to do that was to say that Isabel was his wife and Ruth his sister-in-law, yet he failed to tell Isabel that before they got into their big argument and ending of their friendship. So anyway, here they are now. It's a little bit unclear, a little bit awkward, but that's what's happening. So let's see what happens in the next couple chapters. I'm going to read 34 and 35. And yes, I gave the spoiler alert that when I was screenshotting, I saw someone's name at the end of 35. So I know you guys have predictions, but let's see who pops up again. It's not who you think. Chapter 34. This is a quote from a Massachusetts Lieutenant Thomas Kench writing to the Massachusetts legislature, 1778. It is justifiable that Negroes should have their freedom, and none amongst us held as slaves, as freedom and liberty is the grand controversy that we are contending for. Saturday dawned rainy and cool. I kept a tag tucked in my pocket for the momentous sneezes that exploded from my snout at the worst times. Ruth had a cough, but at least her nose did not resemble a dripping spring. We executed our daily maneuvers, cooking breakfast, washing up after the cooking, fetching the rations for the next 3 meals, preparing the lunch and starting on the supper, more washing up. We had a brief respite between lunch and supper, as the sergeant explained that our fellows would be late returning from fatigue duty. To take advantage of this break in our action, Ruth went with Sibby and the other women to the stream. I'd been tasked with convincing the brigade armorer to repair our smaller cook kettle, which now leaked thanks to my chipping efforts with the hatchet. The poor fellow was so busy hammering, he had scarce time to listen to my request. Nay, lass, he said, sparks flying in the air, only allowed to repair digging tools today. He jerked his head toward the mound of axe heads, shovel blades, and bill hooks behind him. You're welcome to leave it, if you please. Kettles and pans tended to go missing from the blacksmith, Sibby had told me. I'll bring it on the morrow, thank you, sir. I worked my way through the crowd, wondering if burning porridge in the bottom of the kettle would fashion a patch that would stop up the leak, when someone called out to me. Isabel! I turned to see Curzon running. I could scarce believe my eyes. He'd barely spoken to me since our arrival. Oh, he'd been polite enough when I served him roasted meat or coffee, but he never lingered for conversating or joked with me like the other lads did. Once his tin mug and wooden bowl were filled, off he went, his face cloudy and unreadable. Do you need something? I asked, puzzled by this sudden change in his habits. Lose a button from your breeches? He cracked his knuckles. Nay. We stepped off the rough road as a bear-sized man drove a wagon load of tools to the blacksmith. Feeling poorly, I asked, your belly or your pate? It's not that. The blacksmith and the wagon driver started arguing, shaking their fists at each other. Can we, Curzon started. I was told the wagon driver shouted that he had orders from headquarters requiring that everything in his wagon must be repaired by nightfall. The blacksmith erupted with a fountain of foul language that set everyone to chortling. May we go elsewhere, he asked, to talk? I have to start the supper. No, you don't, he cleared his throat. Sergeant told me to take you for a walk on account of how busy I've been and anyway. I tried to tell him you were occupied with your tasks, but he insisted. Fact is, he ordered me. He ordered you to take me for a walk. I looked over his shoulder. Isaac, Drury, and Tall Will, all tent mates of Curzon, stood between us and the blacksmith. They waved at me with great rigor and amusement. Are they to accompany us? He rolled his eyes and shook his head. They're making sure I follow the order. Our predicament gives them great sport. What predicament? He turned and scowled at his mates, then answered my question with one of his own. I pray you, Isabel, may we take that walk, long as we head back to the company. By an indirect path, if it's all the same to you. It wasn't, but his mysterious manner caused me to agree. We walked a bit in an awkward silence, passing a sutler's where strong drink was sold to soldiers with coin to pay for it, then a slaughter yard where the stench of steaming piles of offal had attracted battalions of buzzing flies. Maybe we ought turn upwind, I suggested. Agreed, but give me that kettle, he said, else the lads will chide me for being uncourtly. I handed over the wounded pot. It felt wondrous strange to walk along with nothing in my arms or on my back. Then I sneezed loud as a horse and fumbled for my snot rag. You're not well, Curzon said. You ought rest a day or two. Ruth can't do all the work herself. I'm fine. But you allow her to go on errands alone. She's more capable than I gave her credit for when we first found her. She doesn't have the wit for everything, but she is a fair hand at remembering the location of places, how to reach the washing stream, commissary stores, and the camp kitchen. Regular compass in her brain pan. She's never gotten lost? Not once. She dawdles to talk to the horses, of course, but that's no crime. He shifted the kettle to his other arm. Seems her manner to you has softened some. I tucked my rag back in my pocket. We've softened to each other. He returned my smile. She's lucky to have a sister like you. I am lucky to have her, and grateful. I paused as heat rushed to my face and head, grateful for your steadfast assistance in finding her. I could never have done that on my own. He shrugged. Least I could do. I lost track of the number of times you saved my neck. An acorn bounced off the kettle, thrown by one of the lads following us. I turned to scold them, but they stopped and stared up at a tree, marveling loudly at a nest perched in its branches. Ignore them, Curzon advised. I saw Eben yesterday. He explained what happened with your papers, with Hallahan, how it was you came to the camp. 'Twas never my intention to seek you out, I said in a rush. I didn't know Ebenezer. He explained that you didn't want to involve me, but he knew that I'd listed you as my wife. The words seemed to explode like a cannon shot. We walked again in silence. Why didn't you tell me? I asked quietly. I tried to that night in Williamsburg, but we lost our tempers, and I called you a muzzy-headed blatherskite. He lifted his eyebrows. And you said I had a bizarre attachment to a cause that didn't give a damn about me. I have not yet changed my mind about that. Now who's the blatherskite? You're working for a company filled with black soldiers. We're treated the same as our white compatriots. Same food, same risk, same tents. I don't see any black generals giving the orders. You will, someday. I sneezed again, but before I could dig out my rag, Curzon produced a much cleaner sort from his own pocket and gave it to me. I apologize, he said. Shouldn't have signed you up without your knowledge and leave. I only did it to ensure your safety. It is not natural for me to admit that I'm ever in the wrong, I said, wiping my nose. But I apologize for being so horrid that night. I'm happy you found us a place here. Grateful, again. I handed him his rag, but he shook his head. Sleeve's good enough for me. You hear that we're finally ready to start the digging and open the parallel tonight? I grumbled. Barmy idea, if you ask me. The planned trench that Henry had described to me had been the only topic of conversation around the cook fire for days. Constructing parallels is an ancient part of the proper conduct of a siege. There is a military philosophy behind it all. Barmy, I repeated, that trench won't be ready until Christmas. We'll be digging all day and all night, he protested. Thousands of strong men armed with shovels. Don't matter. He burst out laughing. You're hardly an expert on the construction of siege parallels, country. No, but I'm an expert on getting fields ready for planting. Do you know how heavy the dirt will be with all this rain? It would take weeks, even if you weren't being blown to bits by the lobsterbacks. He set down the kettle and scooped dirt from the road. Put your hand out, please. I sighed, but allowed him to take my hand in his. The warmth of his skin startled me. The three Lubies, Isaac Drury, and Tall Will, hooted with delight. Digging is hard work in the heavy mud of Rhode Island. He poured a slow stream of damp, sandy soil into my palm. But here, the dirt is mostly sand, light as air. We'll have to work hard, but we can do this. You'll see. I let the sand fall between my fingers. A fellow in Captain Bond's company was killed by a 9-pound cannonball yesterday. We're at war, Isabel. Death is an ever-present danger. The rain suddenly fell harder, pattering on the leaves. We walked again, our pace quickened. Perfect weather, Curzon said. Harder for the British to see us tonight in mist and rain. We're supposed to work in silence to avoid detection. Thousands of our soldiers silent? Is that even possible? You said our. Yes, I said our. Have you walked through camp in the dark? I asked. Even asleep, our soldiers sound like 10,000 monsters roaring. No one will be sleeping whilst digging the parallel. What are you shaking your head about? You always see the best of any circumstance, don't you? It's pouring down buckets of rain on our heads, and still you find sunshine. Rain's going to fall, can't change that. The trick of it is to find the good in the rain, the aspect of the positivity. Rains come and rains go, but the sun is always waiting to shine, waiting on the far side of the clouds. What ho, Private Smith, called Drury. He and the others stood a dozen paces behind us. Blasted pumpkins, Curzon muttered. Bumpkins. You are neglecting your sergeant's command in this matter, Isaac said. What is he rattling on about? I asked. Curzon puffed out his cheeks with air, then exhaled noisily. I must pretend to kiss you now, or we shall never hear the end of it. I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. I beg your pardon? They won't shut their gobs about my mistreatment of you, my lack of husbandly kindness. Sergeant agrees, God help us, which is why those cods are following us and leering like jack-o'-lanterns. I'm supposed to make up for my recent coldness to you. My apologies, Isabel. 'Tis not my intention to be disrespectful or offer you insult. Between the rain, my stuffed nose, and the unusual circumstances, I was not sure I understood what he was saying. You want to kiss me? They want me to kiss you. That clarified things somewhat. But you don't want to kiss me? Yes, no. He shook his head in confusion. Most of all, I don't want to make you mad. I'm completely skilled at it. Uncommonly skilled at it. Indeed, I agreed. We both seemed unsure of this matter. We require a ruse, methinks. I wiped the rain from my face and took my shawl from my head. Think of this as a shield for our privacy. Hold that corner of it. He did as I asked, then followed my motion as I raised the scarf until it fluttered in the rain like a curtain. Isaac, Drury, and Tall Will could not see if I was smiling or wiping my nose. Bring your face close into mine, but don't you dare kiss me if you value your life. He followed my orders. May I touch your shoulder? I whispered. His face was so close to mine that my eyes crossed a bit, making it look as if he had 3 eyes, not 2. Seems a touch that this is the sort of thing a person might do whilst kissing. His mouth gaped open, then shut, like a fish flopping on a riverbank. I do believe that is true. I reached out with my free hand. Heat from his skin warmed his damp shirt. The muscles in his shoulder were hard as iron. I had the strangest sensation in my belly, like toads were hopping inside it again. I told myself this was a sign that my illness was moving from my nose to my innards. I cleared my throat. How long should we stand like this? Bit longer, he whispered. Make me a promise? Anything, he answered without hesitation. Stay clear of the cannonballs when you're digging that infernal trench. His easy smile reminded me of the boy he'd once been. I promise. Thank you. I stepped back, jerked the shawl from his fingers, and spun it so that it again covered my head and shoulders. I walked away with my dignity, trying to ignore the applause from our rowdy audience and the sudden heat that rushed to my face. Oh. Chapter 35. This is a pension application of Sarah Osborne, who worked for her husband's unit, the 3rd New York Regiment at Yorktown. Sarah took her stand just back of the American tents and busied herself washing, mending, and cooking for the soldiers, in which she was assisted by the other females. General Washington opened the trench. That is to say, he sank the first pickaxe into the ground. Normally, such a thing would have been done with banners waving and drums beating, but that would have drawn unwanted lobsterback attention. Thus, the general sank his pickaxe into the ground, bowed to a gentle applause, and stepped out of the way so the men could proceed with their task. We could not see this work, of course. We stayed at the company campfire to keep it blazing high. The lads would need something hot to drink and would want to warm themselves when their night's work was done. Besides, it rained hard enough that we couldn't have seen the digging if we'd stood 10 paces away. The captain's tent was close to the fire, but we would have broken 10 kinds of rules had we stayed dry and warm in there. I suppose no one would have raised a fuss if we'd stayed in the tent where Curzon slept, seeing as they all thought he and I were wed, but that was quite a distance from the fire, and we'd get twice as wet dashing back and forth to keep the flames alive. Ruth and I erected a sad excuse for a hut in an attempt to provide ourselves with fireside shelter. We hammered long poles into the ground a pace in front of the woodpile, then draped a cast-off piece of canvas atop the pile and tied it to the poles so that it could behave as a roof for us. It was not much for behaving, letting in as much rain as it kept out. Fool notion, Ruth grumbled as we huddled under the dripping canvas. Being moles. We're not moles, I said. Ducks, mayhaps. Not us, them. Moles dig holes, not soldiers. Indeed. I paused and waited for the echoes from 2 cannon blasts to die away. Must be busy moles tonight. Safe moles, I hope. There was another long rumble. Thunder, not cannon fire. Quack, Ruth muttered. Beg pardon? We're ducks. Quack, quack. It was a joke of sorts, but Ruth's smile was brief. She'd been troubled since we heard of the tales told by the latest British deserters. Conditions in Yorktown were dire, they said. Hundreds of the redcoats' horses had been shot because there was no food for them. Their bodies had been thrown into the river in the hopes they'd be washed out to the sea. The tide brought back the rotting corpses and deposited them on the riverbanks, where they remained. The soldiers were hungry too and limited to restricted rations. And now, bilious fever had broken out. She was heartbroken about the horses, of course, but her true concern was still for Aberdeen. I had hoped that her fondness for him would fade as she struck up new friendships in the camp, but it had not. He had been her friend for as long as she could remember. His absence weighed heavy on her heart, and I knew not how to ease her sorrow. By the time the lads returned at dawn, filthy and soaked from hair to boots, we had the fire roaring despite the rain and served them fresh coffee and hot stew. Their voices fell over one another, teasing, boasting, hooting with laughter, as joyful as a group of boys who'd been chasing pigs for fun. To hear them tell it, the entire night had been one long game, each company trying to outdo the others in how much trench they could dig before dawn. The gloom and rain had indeed protected them from discovery. The false French attack on the western redoubts had helped too. I finished serving out the stew, but still had several bowlfuls in the kettle. I peered through the rain. I counted the men and came up short. Curzon and several others were missing. And then he came running up the road, Isaac at one side of him, Henry on the other, all of them laughing. I sneezed again and shook my head in frustration. Staying awake all night in the rain was having a woeful effect on my health. All hail Lord Shellhawk, crowed Drury. To Shellhawk, the others lifted their cups in a toasted directed at Curzon. He grinned, abashed. Enough of that. Let me eat. I ladled out his stew. What did they call you? Your man earned himself a nickname last night, Henry explained. A shell flew in so quick upon the heels of a previous shot, no one could move fast enough, except for Lord Shellhawk. There, he drove at the three lads in harm's way. Dove. Crushing our tender bones into the earth, exclaimed a fellow by the woodpile. Saved them from harm. I need not have done it, Curzon said sheepishly. Blasted thing landed far enough away. That's not the point, Henry said. You sought to protect them from mortal danger. But how could a shell cause such harm? I asked. The men stared at me with astonished mortification. Beg pardon, Henry said. Do you not know what a shell is, missus? I've held them in my hands, of course, I said. The sea casts up all manner of shells. They can be fashioned into buttons. The fellows exploded into such loud laughter it fair made the ground shake beneath. Indeed, a few laughed so hard that tears came to their eyes. Armies cast up much deadlier shells, country, Curzon explained gently. Mortar shells, hollow iron balls packed with gunpowder and fired from cannons. A cannonball will kill a lad by taking off his leg or head, but the explosion of a shell can injure many, even kill them. Ready, lads, called Isaac. On your feet for a new drill. They all stood. Prepare for the Lord Shellhawk maneuver. They crouched, grinning like children. Shell! They launched at one another, tumbling and rolling in the mud, laughing so hard I thought they'd wet their breeches, which I'd then have to wash, but they'd earned their fun. Curzon caught my eye. I lived up to my promise, country, avoided all cannonballs and even the exploding shells. You must continue to do so, I said. A true promise lasts forever. The fever excitement of the encampment burned high as work continued on the trench, along with preparations for the cannons, which were due to arrive at any moment. Ruth's mood, however, turned vexatious. She was not sour with me in particular, not like those dreadful months after we found her. She'd gotten out of sorts with the entire world, absent-minded and secretive, unwilling to respond to the friendly teasing of Curzon and the others. I questioned her about this in a gentle manner, but she drew inside herself and would give me no answers. The morning the long-anticipated cannons finally arrived, Sibby asked if I could spare Ruth to help her with the washing at the frog pond. I was grateful for the offer. With Ruth in trusted hands, I took the small kettle I'd injured with my hatchet to the blacksmith, who had finally agreed to repair it. As I returned from the forge, I was startled to see Ruth walking ahead of me on the road. She should have been at the frog pond till midday. Something about her manner was odd. She walked slowly, her haversack over her shoulder, occasionally peering into the high thorn bushes that grew on the right side of the road. Had a goat or pig escaped into the undergrowth? A chicken? When we reached the crossroads, she turned left to make her way to the cook fire. I followed, but said nothing to her about what I'd seen. She was more vexatious as the day went on, forgetting to turn the pork and thus burning it, and neglecting to return the knives to their box. Come supper time, she claimed she was not hungry, wrapping her bread and meat in a rag and stowing it in her haversack. I felt her forehead for fever and made her remove her boot to prove that the old wound on her foot had not again filled with pus. She called me a looby and stuck the foot in my face so I could fully appreciate that everyday stink of it. The old wound had not reopened, and my relief was such that I did not scold her. Our fellows had the duty of guarding the trench diggers that night. They marched off as soon as they had devoured their meal. While I washed up, Ruth split enough firewood to keep the fire going and make sure that our breakfast tasks would be easier. She swung the axe with anger, it seemed, but only shook her head when I asked if anything troubled her. Once she'd split and stacked enough wood, she said she was tired and wanted to go to our hut and sleep, even though it was long before we normally turned in. I'll walk with you, I said, thinking to ask Sibby and Christina if they'd heard the rumors that the British Prince, William Henry, was to be kidnapped from New York. No, Ruth exclaimed. You stay here. Are you sure you feel well? There is camp fever in the Pennsylvania regiment, all manner of bowel disorders, as they say. You stay here, she repeated. She would not meet my eye, which signaled to me that she was definitely up to mischief. Go on then, I said, and sleep tight. I followed her. Her mind was not devious enough to check behind her or try to disguise her path. She was not headed to our hut. I thought she might be planning to visit her friends in the horse corrals. That would explain why her supper was carefully wrapped in her haversack. She was bringing a treat for the pregnant mare owned by a French officer with an unpronounceable name. Critters made her feel better when people didn't. Dark comes early in October, bringing pumpkin bright sunsets and showers of falling leaves. A few drifted down upon Ruth, but she didn't look up, didn't marvel at their beauty. She strode forward until she reached the hedgerow of thorn bushes where I'd spotted her earlier. She paused then, and for the first time looked about her. Her face brought to mind a child stealing a forbidden slice of cake. I slid behind a sutler's booth and watched, amazed as the thorn hedge was mysteriously parted by unseen hands. Ruth removed her haversack and handed it through the opening. A moment later, the sack reappeared, looking limp and empty. Ruth grabbed it, said something to the bushes that I could not hear, then hurried away in the direction of the women's huts. She was crying. I was torn between wanting to talk to her and needing to know who was hiding behind the hedge. I waited until she was out of sight, picked up a stout stick, and walked up to the hedge. The thorn bushes parted. Aberdeen's face appeared in the shadows. Please, Isabel, he called hoarsely. That was the name that I said that I saw. What is Aberdeen doing there? He doesn't sound well. We will have to read on in person for those of you in person at Star King on Monday. Otherwise, I will share the next couple chapters with you, and I can't wait to talk about these. Thanks for listening. Have a good weekend.